Hello and welcome to First Bank's Center for Family-Owned Businesses webinar series. I'm Mike Vandervelde and I'll be your facilitator. Today, we'll explore how buy-sell agreements help protect your company's future. Just a quick reminder, the lines are muted, but at any time, please send us your questions through the webinar tool. At this time, I'll pass it over to the host of our program, Mr. Joe Ambrose.
Thanks, Mike. Good morning to everyone and welcome. I'm Joe Ambrose, Executive Director of the First Bank Center for Family-Owned Businesses. Through the center, First Bank takes a holistic view of family-owned enterprises and delivers services to them beyond traditional bank products. These services are centered on insight and advice that address the family component of family-owned businesses. If you remember from our webinar in December on family conflict, members of a family-owned business wear three hats: family member, employee, and owner. Our presentation today focuses on you as an owner. No matter how well planned in advance, an ownership structure that works for one set of circumstances or one generation may not work so well for the next generation. What options do you have to address this evolution of circumstances? Our guest today, Paul Klug of Polzinelli, will discuss the option of buy-sell agreements. Our own David Frederick will join him in the discussion. And now, without further ado, Paul and David.
Well, thank you very much, Joe. It is an honor and pleasure to be here. My name is David Frederick. I'm the Director of Client Success and Advice with First Bank Wealth Management. My job is to help clients plan for their financial future, especially as it relates to their estate planning, their business planning, and my goal is to help clients sleep better so they can dream bigger. I'm joined with by Paul Klug, who is a shareholder with the Polzinelli Law Firm here in St. Louis. Paul has over 30 years of experience in business and corporate transactions. Paul is focuses his practice on family-owned businesses and knows all aspects of that with a tremendous amount of experience and work in that area. Paul, how are you doing this morning?
Very good, David. Thanks for having me. Good morning.
Good morning. Well, let's start off simply. This is a webinar on buy-sell agreements in the context of family business. So let's start at the beginning. Paul, what is a buy-sell agreement?
Sure, David. A buy-sell agreement is an agreement among owners, and that could be shareholders of a corporation, could be members of an LLC, partners of a partnership. But it's an agreement where the basic premise is that transfers of the ownership interest will not occur and are restricted except as otherwise provided in the agreement. So that's the premise. And so the agreement will go on to provide a series of triggering events that might cause a sale or purchase of someone's shares, including death, disability, termination of employment, and other events that might occur or might be important to the family. It will also go on to say if a triggering event does occur, how to value that interest for purposes of buying and who's going to buy that interest. Is it the other owners or is it the company itself? So we'll address very basic things such as those things. We'll also talk about how the payout, if there is a purchase, occurs. So is the payment over time? Is it funded by life insurance upon death? There's various things and various ways that the payout may occur so that the person who's selling can reap the benefits of their interest. On the other hand, you don't want to tax the company and force them to buy someone out and utilize too many resources and put financial stress on the business. And then finally, there's other provisions that you can often find in a buy-sell agreement. Things such as governance might be addressed in the buy-sell agreement, directors, qualifications, other things. There might be restrictive covenants, such as confidentiality or non-competes or non-solicitations. Sometimes we'll see an agreement go on to provide things of that nature as well.
Okay, very good. So in my experience, buy-sell agreements typically arise when business partners are not related to each other. They come in place to make sure that if your business partner passes away or is incapacitated or goes bankrupt or maybe gets divorced, whatever it may be, buy-sell agreements come in the third-party context. But this is the First Bank Center for Family-Owned Businesses, and we're talking about buy-sell agreements in the family-owned business context. So let me ask you specifically, Paul, how can a buy-sell agreement be used in a family-owned business?
Sure. So the basic premise of keeping the ownership closely held is almost twofold in the family business, right? Because you want it to strictly be limited to family members. And so in the buy-sell agreement, you can define who are those permitted shareholders, who are those family members who are permitted to own shares, and potentially who are those family members who aren't permitted to own shares, as well as you can address voting rights with regard to, there could be a select group of family members who you want to have the vote during their lifetime versus not having the vote, and how that might pass on. And so from a family's perspective, there also may be family members who are included on the agreement and those that are excluded, who may, through estate planning or otherwise be taken care of with other assets other than the family business. You may also be able to address things that get into, again, governance and management, and potentially succession from a management perspective as well as the ownership perspective. It depends on how sophisticated and complicated the agreement might become, but these are all things from a family's perspective that certainly can be addressed, as well as from a valuation perspective, to the extent there might be a gifting program or other things that are set up to pass the family business on, that you want those people who might be receiving those gifts to be parties to an agreement so they don't have to sign up later. You want to make sure that they're subject to the agreement and their shares remain subject to the agreement. So all these things can be put into place ahead of time, really to avoid conflict.
Excellent. So it can be a very useful tool within the family-owned business context. Well, hopefully on the line with us, we have a number of business owners and family-owned business owners. And let's see if we can get a little bit of audience participation. Mike, would you please queue up the first poll question so we can poll the audience?
Absolutely. So grab your mouse, and at this time, go ahead and click your answer. The question is, do you have a buy-sell agreement in place for your business? It's either yes, no, or not a business owner. So let me just go ahead and give you about 30 seconds or so. I see the votes are starting to come in now. And once again, go ahead and make your selection. Do you have a buy-sell agreement in place for your business? Another 10 seconds or so, and we'll go ahead and close the poll at that time. So just get those last second answers in. And okay, and it looks like we have a good portion that have responded. So let me go ahead and close that poll, and let's take a look at the results. All right, David, what do you think?
Well, Mike, I apologize. I cannot see the results up on my screen. I think that's because I'm a panelist, and they may be locked out of it. But can you read off the results so that we can hear them?
Sure, absolutely. So the poll results are 29% yes, 36% no, and then 36% are not business owners.
Excellent. Okay. So it does look like buy-sell agreements are something that some of our audience members are entering into, but there's still a substantial portion, a little bit more than have them, don't have them, and maybe worth considering them. So let's consider them a little bit deeper, Paul. Tell me, what, if any, pitfalls do business owners face when they enter into a buy-sell agreement?
Sure, David. There's pitfalls when you enter into them, and just as importantly, pitfalls when you don't enter into them. But I would say when you enter into them, there's provisions that you want to keep an eye out for. I'll give you a few examples. One would be to the extent that your company is either owned by a holding company format or might have brother sister companies, to make sure you have the right parties to the agreement, to make sure companies are covered, to make sure the ownership interests are covered, and that if you start a new business or you start up a new company or form a new entity, that somehow that falls under the current buy-sell agreement, or you have to do an amendment to pull that company and those ownership interests in. So that would be number one. Number two would be if it's a flow-through entity like an S Corp or an LLC that's taxed as a partnership, oftentimes in a buy-sell agreement, there'll be a provision with regard to dividends and whether there's mandatory dividends that have to be paid to the owners each year to cover the flow-through tax liability. So that's something to keep an eye out for, because if you are an owner of a flow-through entity, absent an agreement, you might have flow-through tax liability as a result of that, with no obligation whatsoever on the company to pay a dividend or pay a distribution to cover that liability. Third is the valuation mechanism and how to value these interests when there might be a triggering event. So there's various ways to do that. One might be by a certificate of agreed value, where the owners each year or every 18 months agree to value the business and affix that value and take all the guessing games out of it. If there's a triggering event, you have a set value that's revisited by the owners every, say, year or 18 months. One thing to be concerned about there is to the extent that might get too old. So if your agreement is not flexible and doesn't say, hey, we'll do a certificate of agreed value. However, if that value is, say, more than 18 months old or 2 years old, we need to have an alternative value, in place, because that value may be too high or too low depending on 18 or 24 months of company performance. So those are a few examples of things. Even once you have an agreement, you want to make sure you keep an eye out for and address those things so that you don't spend a lot of time, spend a lot of money putting the agreement together only to leave holes in them.
Right. And your last response about valuation was one that really caught my attention. And as you think about a buy-sell agreement is kind of an interesting document because it gives the obligation to purchase onto the buyer, that they must in fact or potentially can exercise the right to purchase the company, the shares on the buyer. And to put an obligation to purchase on someone means that they have to be able to fund that purchase. They have to be able to come up with financing for the purchase or cash for the purchase. So let me ask you this. How do buyers in a buy-sell agreement typically finance the purchase obligations that arise from a buy-sell agreement?
Sure. So in the buyout provision, there will be terms of payment, right? So how is that purchase price going to be paid? Is it going to be paid in a lump sum? Is there going to be a significant down payment? Is the buyer or the seller going to take back a note? Is that note going to have security? So there's plenty of questions to answer there or ask there, but the answer as to how to fund it, certainly upon death, one focus is always on, what life insurance is in place that might cover the substantial owners. The ones where if there is a triggering event, it causes a buyout if it's a 75% owner or an 80% owner or even a 51% owner. If that's going to cause a buyout that's going to be so significant that it could hurt the company or the other owners financially, to be able to fund that or to pay it out, you need to be careful with that. And so on death, life insurance is a very good answer. Life insurance can be reviewed, it can be updated each year, and it can be referenced in the agreement. Some agreements will have a schedule of life insurance. There'll be obligations to keep that in place while the agreement is in place. So that's a good method of doing it. Sometimes you'll see disability insurance. If someone were to become disabled, there might be an offset for the proceeds of a disability policy to the extent that could fund part of the purchase. And then again, just paying it over time, making sure that it doesn't tax the company. And even having provisions that, what if something happens to two people, within a 6-month period? All of a sudden now the company or the other owners may either have an option or an obligation to buy somebody out. Now they have that doubled. And so to be able to be flexible with regard to postponing payments, stretching that payment period out over time helps to make sure that the buyout's affordable. But again, at the same time, making sure that the person who's getting bought out doesn't necessarily have to wait forever to get their payout.
Right. So I heard a couple of answers there. Take the money over time with the take back note. But I heard central to what you're saying, life insurance. And life insurance is an excellent product. It is very flexible, as you were mentioning, and it's one that can provide financing on this. So I'm curious how many of those that have buy-sell agreements in place will in fact have life insurance. Mike, let's ask the audience. Can you pull up the second poll question, please?
All right, absolutely. That poll is open now. It says, do you have life insurance to fund your buy-sell agreement? And your options for answers are yes, no, and not a business owner. So once again, do you have life insurance to fund your buy-sell agreement? Let me go ahead and give you another 30 seconds or so. And the answers are rolling in. I'm going to give you another 15 seconds to respond. Again, just grab your mouse, click your answer to the question on the screen. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and close this poll now, and then let's take a look at the answers. So the answers are 15% yes, 48% no, and then again, 37% not a business owner.
All right, so it seems as though there was a substantial percentage more had buy-sell agreements than had life insurance in place for them. Paul, picking up on what you said, I think life insurance is an excellent tool, and when people consider their buy-sell agreements, I would encourage them to consider how life insurance, disability insurance, or other insurance products might go along with the ability to fund the purchase by the obligated purchaser. Let's press on though. So buy-sell agreements, one of the things that you mentioned previously was buy-sell agreements are put in place and then valuation may need to be updated. Life insurance might need to be looked at and updated with its flexibility. So you use the word review and update. Let me ask you, how often should business owners review their buy-sell agreements?
Sure, David. I would say, a baseline would be maybe every 3 to 5 years, similar to the way they would review their estate planning documents. So to the extent that, the estate planning documents and a buy-sell agreement often go hand in hand. And, one's really not exclusive of the other. Oftentimes, estate plans will reference a buy-sell agreement and vice versa in the document itself. So you want to try to make sure that those, especially in a family, where there's succession issues and where there could be funding issues and when there's other issues to address, it's good to have a nice cohesive package of your buy-sell agreement sort of tied in with your estate plan, revisiting that every 3 to 5 years. And then I would also say, if something significant happens in the company, for example, you get a big contract and the value goes way up, that may be a reason to revisit the buy-sell agreement before that 3 to 5 years is up. Same thing if there's a downturn and the business, goes way down. If the value goes down, that may be an opportunity to make gifts, to increase gifts. And so there's planning that can be done around those things, and revisiting the buy-sell agreement in that respect. Should happen every 3 to 5 years, but could be triggered by other events, similar to the way you'd revisit estate planning documents.
Excellent. So 3 to 5 years as a base, but also consider that there's a context to it, and that the context of your business may change. If values go up, values go down, probably if someone dies or a partner comes in or out, should be reconsidering that. One of the things I found compelling about your answer just now was that buy-sell agreements are part of a package, part of a whole, and that they probably stride the line between corporate planning documents and, especially in the family business context, estate planning documents. So understanding, Paul, that the buy-sell agreement is part of a package, what other corporate or estate planning documents do you often see accompanying the buy-sell agreement in family business planning?
Sure, David. Oftentimes there's a stockholders agreement might also be tied to some executive employment agreements. There may be key family members who, hand in hand, you want to make sure you have their employment zipped up or tied up, as well as the ownership of the business. So sometimes you'll see them go hand in hand with employment agreements. On the estate planning side, there's sort of the host of estate planning documents that would be in place anyway: a revocable living trust, a pour-over will, other documents, powers of attorney, and what have you that go with that. But the other key thing is if you're going to do a revocable living trust, make sure you take the extra step to fund the revocable living trust and actually retitle the ownership interest in the trust and make sure that the trust becomes a party to the agreement. So you want to make sure that the trust becomes a party to the stockholder agreement. And oftentimes a permitted transfer that's provided within the document itself is, if I want to transfer my shares from me individually or my LLC interest to a revocable living trust, or retitle them in the name of a revocable living trust, I can do that. That's a permitted transfer under the stockholder agreement without anyone's consent, other than the fact that I typically have to give the company notice so they know what's going on. And then I also want to make sure, from the company's perspective, that trust signs a document that says, hey, I'm joining as a party to the agreement, what's often referred to as a joinder agreement or a joinder document. It's a very simple one-page document, but just to make sure now that the trust has the title to the stock or the LLC interest, that trust is also a party to the shareholder agreement. Shareholder agreement doesn't have to be redone. It doesn't necessarily even have to be amended, except to the extent of making sure that the trust itself signs off as a party to the agreement.
All right, so the package that surrounds the buy-sell agreements, there are estate planning structures like the trust you mentioned, may require some updating to the corporate planning structure, perhaps not revising the entire shareholder agreement. But it is one of those things where I would suggest that the structure surrounds it. There's no reason to be afraid to implement a buy-sell agreement for fear that you'll have to redo the whole structure. It can fit right into the estate planning package and the corporate planning package, like you said. So if we have a review schedule of every 3 to 5 years, and in response to major events, I am curious, and maybe Mike can help me with this, I'm curious how many people have put in place a buy-sell agreement and then have regularly reviewed it and potentially updated it versus have let it sit for a long period. Mike, can we go ahead and go on to the third poll question, please?
Absolutely, absolutely. So grab your mouse and you should be seeing that on your screen now. It says, when is the last time you reviewed your business or estate planning documents, such as a buy-sell agreement? And your options are in the last 12 months, last 1 to 5 years, last 10 plus years, put in place and never reviewed, or have no planning documents in place. So once again, go ahead and grab your mouse and select your answer, maybe about 30 seconds or so. All right, another 15 seconds or so. I see the votes are still coming in. Let's see, just another 5 seconds. Any last second answers, go ahead and click that now. And all right, we're going to go ahead and close this poll now and take a look at the results. So the results are 25% say they are in the last 12 months, 17% the last 1 to 5 years, 13% at plus 10 years, 8% put in place but never reviewed.
Okay, thank you, Mike. So we do have some people who are being very diligent in reviewing their corporate planning, their estate planning documents, including their buy-sell. Some people potentially, even after this webinar, might go and dig those out of the corporate binder and take it around and take a look at it. And some people, as we saw in earlier polls, may have a closely held business, a family-owned business, and still not have a buy-sell agreement in place. So, Paul, let's give the people some instructions they may be able to act on. What steps should a business owner take if they want to put in place a buy-sell agreement? How would they get started?
Sure, David. So I think the first steps are to make sure you gather, whatever documentation is available, so that you're not, searching for it or paying professionals to look for things when you can look for them yourself. So I would try to see if you've done any agreements in the past. See if you can pull any type of old agreements together. Also, pull your records together. So if you're a corporation, you likely have stock records, and those stock records are likely either maybe in a safe in the company's records, or they could be with your attorney or with the accounting firm. So you want to make sure you pull those ownership documents together. If it's an LLC, there's probably an LLC operating agreement that's going to sort of set forth, typically in an exhibit, as to who owns what percentage, and try to get those documents together and then sit down with your professional team, whomever you're most comfortable with. It could be your attorney, it could be your accountant, it could be your insurance person. Sit down with them, or your commercial banker, and sit down with them and say, hey, here's kind of the situation. We have either one owner now and we want to add some owners. We have some kids, we want to start a gifting program. We want to, the value of the business has gone down. Maybe we should consider, making some gifts and putting an agreement in place. Or, all of a sudden, someone's getting older and there's no agreement in place at all. And, what are we doing with these shares? What are we doing with these LLC interests with regard to an older person, a younger person, somebody decides they want to change and resign and go work for somebody else? I've had situations where, somebody has resigned. A key employee, for example, has resigned and left with some interest outside the family and gone to work for a competitor. And so there's things that might prompt you to think about it. And really the steps are pull whatever documentation you have together, and then sit down with your professional advisor and or advisors and chart out a way to get an agreement in place.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for those basic instructions. And let me just say that, Paul, your details were part of the invitation to this webinar. If somebody is looking for an attorney to review their buy-sell agreement or potentially put one in place, I'd encourage you to reach out to Paul at Paul Sinelli. Likewise, if you're interested in having your estate planning documents, including your buy-sell agreement, your business structure documents reviewed, you can reach out to me. My details were included. Also, at First Bank Wealth Management, we can help with a number of ancillary aspects of buy-sells, including certainly life insurance, disability insurance, and financing that goes along with them. Again, at First Bank Wealth Management, our goal is to help people sleep better so they can dream bigger. Well, Paul, thank you so much for letting me put you on the hot seat and run you through a number of questions on buy-sell agreements as they relate to the family-owned business context. I think that I've run through my list of questions, but I'm sure that there are some questions coming in from the audience. So, Mike, can we open it up to the questions coming in from the chat, please? And Paul will take us through this.
Absolutely. So if you would, go ahead and type a question directly into the webinar tool, and we'll go ahead and ask that to our two presenters. So let me start with the first one here. It says, can I write my own buy-sell agreements for my business, or do I need to get a lawyer?
So, David, I can take that one, and I think you can probably chime in as well. There's resources on the internet. There's other, you might find resources. You might have a friend who has one who could give you a copy and say, oh, maybe I can work with this. I'm not saying you can't do it, but I'd advise to talk to your professional advisors and make sure you're getting a good updated format. Make sure that the biggest thing is, firms start with templates or forms, but it's really going to only be as good as it's customized to your situation. And oftentimes there's really no two situations that are the same. So to the extent that you have a boilerplate agreement, that might work. However, my guess is that when something happens, you might look back and say, I probably should have customized this a little bit. I probably should have made sure that it was more attuned to what I wanted to accomplish, not just a generic form. So I think that probably addresses it.
Yeah, and let me add to that a little bit, Paul. In my role as Director of Client Success and Advice at First Bank, I do review people's estate plans, and I review their business succession documents. And I often get the question of, well, do I really have to pay a lawyer, or can't I just do this myself? And I always give the conservative answer, which is the lawyer is there to help you because we don't know exactly what comes down the road. And I'll tell people that some of these buy-sell agreements are triggered on death. And when someone has died, it's too late for them to go back and sort out any problems. But it's the lawyer's job to view problems that may be coming down the road. Likewise, even if someone hasn't died, if there's a problem with a buy-sell agreement, the way to hash it out may be through a costly court proceeding or arbitration or mediation, all of which is going to cost more on the back end. As you try to save a couple $1,000s on the front end, you might end up costing yourself tens of thousands of dollars on the back end. So these are the kind of documents that you want done right. And the way to do them right is to have a qualified attorney professional draft it with you, draft it for you, and put their expertise on this document. Mike, do we have more questions?
Yeah, very good. Thanks for that question and that answer. A quick reminder, if you have a question, just go ahead and pop open that webinar tool and type it in there. Next one says, are there any tax advantages or disadvantages to using a buy-sell agreement to move a family business?
So the tax issues, there's a host of tax issues that are typically visited and revisited often when it comes to looking at a succession plan. One knockoff is the thing that I mentioned earlier, and that is just the annual flow-through taxation and making sure that there might be a provision in there that requires either an optional or a mandatory dividend to cover that for the owners so that the minority owners don't get stuck with a big tax bill. So that's one tax issue that typically is addressed. If you're an S corporation, there's oftentimes a host of provisions sort of surrounding limitations on who can be owners of S corporations. And so you're going to want to make sure that if you're an S corporation, you stay an S corporation. And so there's some agreements you'll see, or provisions in the agreement you'll see that sort of work around what we just refer to as the S corporation provisions or section. And then, is there a strategy with regard to maybe how you value the business within the buy-sell agreement that can help or hurt on the back end if something does happen, especially the death of somebody from an estate tax perspective. Again, I've referenced often, setting up gifting programs, trying to make gifts of shares. There's a strategy with respect to taking discounts. So with respect to, a company that's worth $1 million with so many shares outstanding, they may have an equal value, but if it's a minority interest, it's non-voting, that doesn't, can't be sold other than complying with the agreement, there's discounts that can be taken. And so there's some strategy there with respect to how to take those discounts and pass probably more value than you think onto that next generation during your lifetime. So yes, there are provisions and mechanisms within the agreement that can help address some tax issues.
Yes, I would agree with that, and let me expand that outward a little bit. That the buy-sell agreement itself is not a magical document. It doesn't cause the capital gains tax to go away, but it is surrounded by tax issues that can be made fortuitous or advantageous to the taxpayer. For instance, if it's funded with life insurance is an excellent investment. It is income tax, the death benefit is income tax free. It can be estate tax free in the right structure, and that can be used to fund, especially with a step up in basis for the assets that are being purchased. But also, one of the things that Paul mentioned earlier is that the buy-sell agreement can fit into a lot of different estate planning structures. And estate planning structures like the intentionally defective grantor trust or a family limited partnership structure are themselves tax advantaged, and the buy-sell agreement can flow into those. So don't think that the buy-sell agreement is a magic bullet to make taxes go away, but it can be part of a comprehensive business structure plan and an estate plan to mitigate taxes to the extent possible. And that's another reason for professionals to come into the process and not for do-it-yourself business owners to try to navigate all the taxes by themselves. Mike, do we have any more chat questions?
We do. So we have a couple more that just came in now. This one says, and let me, hopefully I got this right. What would you suggest is best practice or most common for interest rate tied to payout and typical length of payout, 3 years, 5 years, assuming it's not a hardship on the business?
Sure. So on the interest rate, I would say there's a couple of schools of thought on that one. Oftentimes you'll see an interest rate that's a fixed rate and based on what's called the applicable federal rate. And that's typically done such that the applicable federal rate is going to allow you to use the lowest interest rate possible. So if someone gets bought out, are they really making money? Do you really want to pay them for the interest? Or do you really just think that their interest should be primarily principal, right? What's the value of that interest? If it's $5 million, that's great, we'll pay you $5 million. But when you add a high interest rate like 7% or 8% or 10%, all of a sudden that person's going to get a lot more money. So one way to look at it is to keep it affordable to those buying out is to use the applicable federal rate, whatever's in effect at the time that the note's put into place. You can look it up, you can stick it in the note, and that's going to allow for the lowest rate. So again, that's going to benefit the buyer much more than the seller. To the extent the seller says, well, hold on a second, I should get a little bit more than that, especially the longer term I go out, I think maybe I should get more interest and I should worry about security for that note. Because, the shorter the term, the bigger the payouts, shorter the payout, the interest rate could be low, and I'm not so worried about security. The flip side to it is the longer I go out with a note, probably my interest rate should be higher, and I should be considering security because that payout's going to take more time, which really just puts the more time is, the more uncertainty that might occur that might affect the payout. So there is, I would say the longer term, the higher the interest rate. I would typically say what I see in agreements is anywhere from the applicable federal rate, which would be the lowest, trying to use the lowest rate possible, maybe upwards of 4.5%, 5%. Sometimes you'll tie it to prime, whatever the prime rate is at the time the note goes into place. Could be prime plus, a certain percentage. So there's ways to do it. You can be very flexible, but once you get it into the agreement, it kind of takes the uncertainty out, because at the time of the buyout, you're going to look back to the agreement and use those terms.
It's a rarity, but I have nothing to add. I think that was excellently said. Thank you very much, Paul. Mike, do you have another question for us?
Yes, sir, we do. So this question says, what is the tax implications to a buyer of a business who has entered into a buy-sell agreement where the seller has then taken back a note, then after time the business fails, resulting in forgiveness and debt to the seller?
Do you want to pass that one over to me, Paul? I'll take a shot at this as a tax LLM. So there's a couple of things that are in play there, which is first is the payment on the note. Mike, could you read that one more time, because there were several moving parts?
Yeah, absolutely. So what is the tax implication to a buyer of a business who has entered into a buy-sell agreement where the seller has taken back a note, then after time the business fails, resulting in a forgiveness and debt to the seller?
Okay, so a couple of moving parts in this, but I'm going to focus on the biggest ones. Forgiveness of debt is a type of income. So if you in fact have a debt that is forgiven for you, it is a type of income to you, and it is taxable to the extent of the debt forgiveness. On the other hand, bankruptcy and the discharge of indebtedness at bankruptcy does not typically result in taxable income. So it depends on how you get out of the note, whether you go through a formal procedure that takes you through bankruptcy so that your creditor can get whatever amount he can through the bankruptcy laws, and then take in the forgiveness with no taxable income. That's one way. Or if you just get forgiven because your family or because the creditor doesn't have the interest in trying to track you down through the bankruptcy court, then it very well could be taxable income. The other aspect in it is the failure of the business, which whenever I hear failure of the business, I think in terms of something called a net operating loss. Net operating loss is a type of deduction that comes up for the value of the loss of the business and the value of how much is actually spent on the business versus how much is the business worth at the end of a given tax year. Net operating losses are bad news because it means that your business is failing or is having a hard time. But the silver lining of a net operating loss is that it does in fact create a tax deduction that is substantial, and it can be used to offset ordinary income and can be carried forward for a number of years. All that to say is that that question is just complex enough that I don't know if I can necessarily answer it over a webinar in this short a period of time, but I would encourage whoever's asking it to give me a call so we can review the document and review the situation together.
Hey, David, and just to try to pare that down, if the question was the tax implications to the buyer, not the seller, but the buyer. So if I'm a buyer and I give a note and I owe the money to the seller, the principal payments on that note are not deductible to me. The interest payments the interest component might be deductible. Unfortunately, I usually defer that to the accountants who are going to sign off on the tax return to determine whether that interest is going to be deductible or not, but the principal payments would not be. And then if there is, as you said, forgiveness, that buyer, that would be deemed to be income, right? I think. And again, I think that would be, and you'd end up getting taxed on that. So that, to me, on the buy side, not the seller side, but on the buy side, oversimplifying several things, that's where I would come out.
Yes, and that's, the forgiveness of indebtedness is ordinary income in its usual course. And so I'm with you on that. And the deductibility of interest for the buyer is also part of it too. But again, big enough question that a one-on-one conversation would probably be best for that one. I'd encourage you to reach out.
All right, very good. Thanks so much for that. It looks like we have one more question. Short and sweet. Can you force a buy-sell?
Sure, David, I can chime in on this one. I'm sure you can too. The whole reason to put a buy-sell agreement in place is to try to have a roadmap as to who has the right to buy, who has the obligation to buy, who has the right to sell, who has the obligation to sell upon certain events occurring. Absent the agreement being in place, you can't rely on the state statutes, corporate statutes, or state case law they will give me, for example, if David and me, if we were owners of a business and we had no buy-sell agreement, and David, I just, wake up one morning and you decide or I decide we don't like each other. I can't go look at a statute or a case law and say, David, I have the right to buy you out now. And, here's how I'm going to pay you. Here's how I'm going to value that. Here's the payout, et cetera, et cetera. Absent an agreement, a buy-sell agreement that covers those issues, I can't force you out. There might be other ways to get leverage over you. I could potentially, you could fire me or I could fire you if we were working in the business together. But again, even if I did, that still would not necessarily force me to sell. There's provisions in a buy-sell that oftentimes you'll put in called drag-along and tag-along rights for this exact reason. And so, for example, if I want to sell my business and I own a majority, I don't want the minority holding me up. I don't want the minority person standing out there because that might be their opportunity to get more money than that's due. So the buy-sell agreement will often have what's called a drag-along right, where if me or you together own a majority and we want to sell and we like the purchase price, et cetera, we can, quote, drag along the minority owners. Now, the minority owners still get the same terms. So whatever terms I'm getting, they get the same terms, they get bought out. But that's a protective mechanism. It goes back to maybe the second question you asked about things to look out for in agreement. Drag along and tag along rights are something, especially when there's several minority owners, meaning they own less than a majority. You want to make sure that the majority can entertain sale opportunities without being held up by the minority.
Right. Drag along and tag along are fascinating parts, but they're also part of the agreement, prior to the event. And I think that I heard Mike's question as being, can you compel a buy-sell, which I'm going to boil down to, can you compel someone to sell something? And a buy-sell agreement is another mechanism of sale. And as a general matter in the United States, compulsion of sale is not part of our common law. So there are times, I can't walk up to you and say, I demand that you sell me your house. I can do a couple of things. I can convince you with a really high price. I may be able to enter into other agreements that are ancillary to your house, like I lend you money and I put a lien on your house and I can foreclose on that. Or I could be a creditor to you otherwise and I can foreclose, or I could take it in bankruptcy or part of a bankruptcy proceeding. But as a general matter, it's very hard to use. Let me take that back. As a general matter, it's not within the scope of a buy-sell agreement to compel sale without, again, the agreement up front. So it is not a club, but it can help with leverage.
And David, just to add really quickly, in an agreement, so let's get past the point of, okay, we did enter into an agreement, or we are going to enter into an agreement. Those triggering events, say you want to buy somebody out, but a triggering event hasn't occurred. No one's died, no one's become disabled, everybody's still employed. There are provisions that can go into an agreement where one party could have a put right or a call right, where someone could be able to, after some period of time, put their interest back to the business and force the business to buy them out, oftentimes at a discounted price. And if there's a call, sometimes you'll see the company or the majority have the right to buy somebody else out for no other triggering event other than, hey, it's just time, or we want to increase the ownership of the majority. And in a call scenario, I would argue for the minority to probably put a little premium on that price because they might be very happy with where they're at, but if somebody has the right to call my interest. So there are put calls and there are other provisions, deadlock provisions that we didn't talk about. But if it's 50-50 ownership, say by two families or within the family, or there's just things aren't, people aren't getting along, there might be ways there's provisions that you can include that don't necessarily have to be triggered by death, disability, termination of employment, but could be triggered because there's a deadlock, people aren't getting along, et cetera. And then how do you try to unravel that within the agreement?
Excellent. Let me put that into context, and this is probably a good note to end on if there aren't any more questions. That we've talked about buy-sell agreements in the family-owned business context, and then near the end, Paul has talked about drag-alongs, tag-alongs, puts, calls. One of my favorite, by the way, Paul, is the 50-50 partners. How do you decide who buys and who sells? when I was writing these documents, I always used to say that one partner would pick a price and the other partner would decide whether to be bought at that price or whether to buy at that price. It's sort of a, you cut the cake, but I get to pick who gets what piece. There's lots of great provisions like this. So if you have a closely held business, I would encourage you to think about the structure, think about the future of your business, how a buy-sell agreement may fit in with it. If you have any sort of uncertainty about your business, I'd encourage you to reach out to me for a review of estate planning documents, corporate succession documents, insurance that goes along with it. And I also encourage you to reach out to Paul, who is an excellent attorney to be able to structure these things. Your family-owned business is not just a business. It's a legacy. It's a retirement plan. It's a gift to your kids. And it deserves to be protected. Mike, just out of curiosity, are there any more questions?
Yeah, so we did. We actually had one that segues nicely with the comments that Paul had just made. This one says, can you include provisions that control will remain 50-50, no matter if physical ownership shifts? Companies own 50-50, but at some point one side purchases 10% of the other side, so now it shifts 60-40. Would a provision like this be enforceable?
So maintain 50-50 control despite 60-40 ownership, some sort of management agreement, Paul.
Yeah, it depends on how that's structured now, but you could approach it to the extent you could certainly put a provision in that would say, David and I own a company 50-50, and if for any reason one of us would end up with more than 50%, that excess could automatically convert to non-voting stock or non-voting units in an LLC, such that I might own a greater percentage of the underlying ownership or equity, but our vote stays the same. I've also seen where, in that example, if there was an extra 5 or 10 or 15% of mine that would go to David, we could agree that would go into a voting trust, that I would continue to vote during my lifetime, even though David would still have the benefit of the additional 10, 15% of equity. So there's a way to get around that as well using a voting trust. So there are ways to do that. It kind of depends on what the current structure is and if the goals of the owners are aligned in that regard. Yeah, there's some things you could look at, mechanisms to safeguard against one family or one family member getting control. But that, control is a whole nother, that's a big discussion.
Yeah, the control is a discussion goes above and beyond what we're talking about right now. Those kind of agreements can be put in place ahead of the transfer. If you're going to try to do it after the transfer, you probably have to come in with some amount of consideration to buy the restriction or buy the voting block or buy the voting trust. I had a client, just to share a war story, a three-way partnership. One partner owned 45, one partner owned 45, and one partner owned 10. And there was a great tug of war between the two 45s to get control of the 10, to see who they their side so they could get a majority. Eventually, we got it all settled out with a voting trust, but it does come up. Mike, is that it?
All right, that is the last question. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Joe Ambrose for some closing thoughts.
Thanks, Paul and David. I'm certain our viewers enjoyed the insights today, and thanks to everyone for joining us. There is a poll to take right now, so please don't sign off without taking that poll. Please mark your calendars for Tuesday, March 9th at 1 p.m. Central Time. Caitlin Erb of CMA Consulting will present part 2 of handling family conflict and family-owned businesses. Until then, stay healthy. Thank you.